Hi everyone! Thanks for joining us for the fourth installment of our fundraising webinar series. Today's webinar focuses on special events and fundraising campaigns. This webinar is recorded and we'll be sharing a copy of the recording and presentation after the webinar. We'll also have Q&A at the end. During Q&A, you can either use the questions box or the chat box to share your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted, and we can have you ask the question directly yourself. And I'll also repeat these instructions again at the end of our webinar. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Gail, our Vice President of Development.
Thank you, Bessie. Good afternoon, everyone. As Bessie mentioned, welcome to our fourth webinar, Special Events and Fundraising Campaigns, which is a series of development and fundraising webinars. Just a brief note on my background for those of you who are joining us for the first time. I spent some time with both national and local nonprofit organizations, and I appreciate and understand the advantages and challenges both have on our roles in development. The agenda for today is to focus on special events from an overall development perspective, as well as reviewing the ABCs of special event planning and execution. We will also review fundraising campaigns. This fundraising webinar series is designed to be a general overview to touch upon the basics of overall development and fundraising. What is a special event? From a development perspective, today we will consider a special event to be an occasion for the purpose of raising funds, educating your audience on the mission of your organization where they are receiving some sort of tangible benefit. You may recall from the second webinar hosted back in July, the slide in front of you where we discussed donations versus investments from our donors and funders. We talked about donations in this context, aligning with corporate giving, for example, such as sponsorships. These funds typically come from the marketing budget to promote the corporation and receive immediate benefits, such as event tickets, all the while publicly supporting your organization's mission. Corporate foundation support is typically seen as an investment in the nonprofit organization where they believe their support will help lead to positive changes within a community, whether local, regional, or nationally. They also want to be aligned internally and externally with the social change you are seeking, and therefore are not looking for an immediate return on their investment, or ROI. Similarly, for individuals who want to attend your event, while they may be interested in the long-term goals of your organization, they understand there is also an immediate benefit, such as seeing your organization's performance, enjoying the food and beverages, networking with guests in attendance of your event, and so forth. As we turn to this slide, can I ask those of you who are able to share with me your organization's type of yearly event, or more than one if you have several events a year? For example, if your main event is a dinner or a conference or a golf tournament, so forth. This will enable me to address certain elements specific to your type of event. You can type directly into the chat box. These types of events that you see on the slide are various events in an organization can have, which is very limitless. The customary ones include dinners or galas. With the growing number of nonprofit organizations over the years and the decline of corporate sponsors to these typical events, the challenge is to keep donors and funders engaged and interested. I have found that working in several different nonprofit organizations, the community in which you are located and or serve can define what may be popular in that specific region where it may not work elsewhere. For example, when I worked at a local grassroots social service nonprofit organization in Los Angeles, tremendously popular were golf tournaments and dinners, to the extent that I would sometimes have to recall while there which organization I was supporting, which also meant that I typically saw the same people across these events. For our API organization to raise funds, it didn't make much sense for us to endeavor into the same events to use as our fundraisers, so we took a different approach. During the 1980s, where tofu was making an entry into the mainstream of society, and although a main staple for some of the API communities for decades already, our organization decided to do a spin-off of a food festival and created the first tofu festival, where all restaurants that participated had to use tofu in their food preparation. While we enjoyed several years of building a reputation and a donor base through this tofu festival, the organization decided at a certain point that the festival grew much bigger than we were able to maintain and continue. The tofu festival made sense in the Los Angeles community, as the density of the API population enabled those already familiar with tofu to want to attend this novel event and allowed us to introduce the staple to other communities. This also allowed us to reach an audience we never would have had it been simply another dinner or golf tournament. Another consideration is the extent to which it is mission-driven. Dinners in themselves are not mission-driven, but it's the programming during the dinner which drives your ability to incorporate elements of your mission. For example, you may be familiar with blind dinner events embraced by organizations whose missions focus on disabilities such as the sight impaired. Guests are typically blindfolded or eat in the dark while they partake in their dinner, as this serves as a powerful tool in educating guests on the world of the sight impaired. And again, anytime, please feel free to type into the chat box, the type of event that your organization hosts. Okay, now that we've explored the endless types of fundraising events out there, the question is whether or not it's a good idea for your organization to do a special event. There was a study conducted by Charity Navigator a while back that suggested special events are not good sources of funds. The reason being, they found the average nonprofit organization spent $1.33 to raise $1 in special event contributions. But special events can serve many purposes, and your organization needs to determine its priorities in considering doing or continuing a special or a specific special event. The advantages are plentiful. You can increase visibility, cultivate your existing donors, raise necessary funds, and can also create a secondary gain of goodwill amongst your staff, board, and volunteers. There are also disadvantages or challenges. For those of us who have been heavily involved in special event planning, we know all too well that it is very labor-intensive and therefore time-consuming. Have you also witnessed that expenses may not always stay within budget, to no fault of yours necessarily? We also need to take into consideration the impact your fundraising event has on other existing campaigns within your organization. In other words, are you taking away critical funds from other campaigns by doing your special event? Similarly, given the time consumption on staff, typically development staff, is the time taken to plan, coordinate, and execute an event taking time away from other development-related activities necessary to raise funds? And lastly, the nature of the beast of special events is that you cannot anticipate the unexpected. Or what I prefer to say is that you must expect the unexpected. For example, I'll never forget learning this very sentiment while I was working at the American Red Cross. My main responsibility at the time was planning and executing an annual fundraising luncheon where the main attraction was the speaker, with the secondary attraction being our honorees. This planning process was a 10-month process working with a community committee. With the long anticipated luncheon coming to fruition on a Monday, I got a call the Friday before at 3:30 p.m. with the news that our featured speaker had to cancel due to unforeseen circumstances. After months and months and months of marketing and building our event around her to our community, donors, and guests. After I got over my initial heart and panic attack, we used the rest of that Friday and the weekend to come up with a plan B. Donors had to be notified, corrections in the program booklet had to be made, scripts had to be edited, so on and so forth. But at the end, we endured and the event ensued. I'm sure every special event planner has their nightmare story. Now that your organization has decided to move forward with planning an event, is your organization prepared to take on a special event? Or are there any course corrections that are necessary for any existing special event your organization hosts? The takeaway on this slide is determining if you have taken into consideration some key essentials in preparing for an event, whether new or not. Board support. Do your board members support the event? Have they been involved from the discussion phase? The key here is that with your board's valuable time and investment in your organization, it will go a long way to get their buy-in from the get-go. They are also valuable in providing fresh ideas and feedback, as they are probably familiar with other community events they have attended. Human resources. What human resources do you have or do you need? There's staff, board, chairs, honorary chairs, community committee. We already covered the consideration of staff time in the heavy lift of special events and whether the time taken away from other development activities is of worth. To what extent will your board be involved in the planning and execution? Having a working chair and an honorary chair can lend credibility and value on the surface of your event and organization. I've worked in settings with committees and without. There are advantages and challenges to both, namely the time factor and coming to a consensus. But in the end, having community involvement can strengthen and broaden your outreach. Target market. What market or markets will you be targeting to support and attend your event? Researching and determining your market will help you determine your outreach or refine and update your existing outreach. Considerations would be a gap analysis of the current makeup of your audience. In other words, are there folks you like in attendance but are having challenges in appealing to them? Proposed date. Are there competing dates within your organization or within the community? Holidays. Typically, I have found that in most communities, whether ethnic or cause in nature, organizations who have an annual event are already aware of their peer organization's special event dates. If you are looking to institute a first-time event, it would be extremely beneficial to check dates that have basically been grandfathered in by others. The other consideration is an internal calendar. You want to ensure your event is not competing with another activity or project with a conflicting date period. This determination is not only based on the actual event date, but also needs to take into consideration the weeks and months leading up to the event, as the planning may require additional staff or board time. Financial considerations. If this is your first event or of its kind, do you have financial resources to invest? This is a risk all organizations need to take into consideration. What if the event fails? What if along the way a consideration was not made comes to real life fruition and threatens the success or continuation of the planning of the event? Do you hire a special event planner? Does the benefit of hiring an event planner outweigh the cost? While your organization may not practice including staff salary time on a special event budget, the cost of an external special event planner should be noted as an expense specific to the event. Given that covering all details of special events is a full-time course series in itself, what I have listed here are the common ingredients in special events. Of course, not all are necessary, appropriate, or possible for your particular situation. That said, let's take a quick look at this collective list and then focus on what you see italicized thereafter in the continuing slides, as I consider those as requiring a bit more discussion with the time that we have today. As you can see, and probably already know, there are many details and considerations in planning an event. Depending on the type of event, the majorities of these will be critical elements in your specific event. Event goals, revenue and expenses, which will often include sponsorships and underwriting. Timeline, human resources, legal insurance requirements, invitations, whether they're electronic or hard copy, the event program or agenda, the theme around your event. Do you have a star attraction? The event site or venue. Will you need a steering committee? What about an honorary chair or a host committee? The design of the invitation, key players involved in your event, public relations, marketing, logistics, decor, and again, it's absolutely endless. But this list here are what I just consider some common elements. Okay, now that your organization has decided to move forward with a new event or continue with an existing one, are your goals established and clearly communicated to your staff, board, and donors? Let's examine what these goals may be. Visibility. What are the goals to measure your visibility? Is it number of social media posts? Number of likes? The takeaway here is that you have the ability to determine what your visibility goal should be. Cultivation. Is this a factor for your event? It should be. What measures are you putting in place to ensure this takes place? Is your leadership, key staff, asked to greet or meet certain individuals you are seeking to cultivate? Revenue. Given this fundraiser event may be your biggest source of unrestricted funds, what financial goal has your organization put forth? Education. What elements of your programming during your event will you use as measures that educating your audience has taken place? Identification and solicitation of event prospects. What plans, if any, do you have regarding your major donors who may be in attendance? What about prospects? Market identification. How successful will you be in hitting your market audience? How will you know? And finally, logistics. This is an internal measure of success. Will you be evaluating the planning, coordinating, and the executing of your event? The takeaway here is that from beginning to end and throughout the planning, your entire staff, regardless of how involved they are, should be clear on the goals of the event to help drive and support the event with consistency. Also, when asked about the success of the event from the external inquirer, your staff will be on the same page. Okay, let's spend some time on revenue generation and tips on maximizing revenue with the resources that you have. Typical sources of revenue include what you see listed here. While some consider sponsorship and underwriting to be equivalent, there's a slight distinction that can be made between the two, and it's really up to your organization as to how you want to handle it and acknowledge them. Sponsorships are contributions to an event with the understanding that it is considered as revenue to the organization and that it can help pay for event expenses. In return, there are often tangible benefits assigned to the sponsorship. Underwriting occurs when a donor designates the desire to pay for a specific item or expense. For example, if Mrs. Jones wants to pay for the centerpieces as a contribution to your organization, she would be considered the underwriter for the centerpieces. In turn, commonly the organization would then recognize in the program booklet, signage, or on stage that Mrs. Jones has generously underwritten the centerpieces, or the beautiful centerpieces you see at your table has been made possible by Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones would pay the florist directly or give your organization the specific amount of the total cost of the centerpieces so that you can then pay the florist. On the other hand, in-kind contributions are those where the donor is providing the items or services, not the funds to pay for the items or services. Floral centerpieces contributed by the florist is an in-kind contribution. The band you have as your entertainment who is contributing their services, in this case, their time to perform to your audience, is providing you an in-kind contribution if they are letting you know you do not need to pay for their time. In-kind contributors would also be recognized in your signage, program booklet, or on stage. Revenue generated by ticket sales, program ads, etc., can contribute to your overall incremental raised funds. Auctions, whether silent or live, can generate revenue while being an entertainment value add at the same time. Do any of your organizations include raffles as revenue generators? The special mention here is that every state has its rules and regulations in conducting a raffle, or for that matter, if it's even legal to conduct a raffle in your state. For example, in California, a nonprofit wishing to conduct a raffle must first apply in a timely manner and register with a fee to the Bureau of Gambling Control under the state attorney's office. Raffles are considered games of chance, and there are state-specific controls that apply. Please ensure you are following your state's regulations if your organization has been conducting raffles or if you are seeking to conduct a raffle for the first time. The next two slides are an example of AAJC's opportunities to support our annual fundraiser reception. The sponsorships include the benefits received under each category that you see there on the right side of the slide. We'll pause here for just a few seconds. This next slide shows the individual ticket pricing, program ad purchases, in-kind and underwriting opportunities as well. We'll also pause here for a few seconds. Okay, let's now look at expenses. We all know with every event, there are expenses to be incurred. Rather than just simply reviewing common expenses, let's focus on ideas on minimizing costs where possible. Let's first start with the concept of expense to revenue ratio. This is looking at the percentage of your expected revenue and actual costs. Is it okay to spend $90,000 to gross $100,000? This would translate into a net of $10,000. There are those who believe this is okay since you are not losing revenue. Let me ask this question in a different way. When you take into consideration that it's donor dollars that are enabling your organization to conduct an event, is it responsible to invest $90,000 to profit $10,000? In my opinion, I would say no. There is a general standard that for nonprofit organizations, expenses of an event should not exceed 30%. Personally, I attempt to keep that expense to revenue percentage below 25%. Do you or have you ever calculated your expense to revenue ratio? It's one thing to tell your board and your constituents you have grossed $100,000 from an event. Having spent, for example, $60,000 on your event, it's then another to report the net revenue at $40,000 as the bottom line, as it's the $40,000, that's the real number your organization has to fund your organizational needs. Okay, let's now review typical expenses and how we can minimize this list of real costs where possible. Food and beverage. If your event is at a hotel or venue where you must purchase their food and beverages, then there's not much you can do here to minimize your expense and keep the integrity of your food and beverage needs. If your venue is such that you have the control over the catering, then seeking discounts or in-kind contributions from caterers that perhaps one of your board members may have connections to can be very helpful. Venue. Again, there's not much you can do if your event is hosted at an establishment such as a hotel, convention space, so forth. Even though the hotel may waive the fee of the ballroom, it will always be contingent upon you spending a minimum on their food and beverage. Is your event size such that having it hosted at a resident, a large convening room in one of your board members' corporations, an option? Perhaps there may be a local museum, library, or warehouse you can utilize at minimal or no charge. Graphic design. Can you design in-house? Or again, if someone has connections to a graphic designer. Or contact a local design school where students are looking for a project as part of their coursework. Invitations. A simple invitation you can create in a Word document can be sent electronically as your invitation. Program booklet. The typical cost here is the production and printing of the program book. I've seen alternatives including having a one-pager agenda and acknowledging your sponsors on the screen or announcing them at the podium instead. I've also seen an electronic version of the program where it is then shared by email or other app at the event. Mailing. An option would be to use electronic invitations only. Perhaps most of you do this already. For hard copies, an option is to ask one of your board members or volunteers who work at a corporation to absorb your U.S. postal mailing costs with theirs. I've actually done that before. Printing. Depending on your printing needs, consider the electronic version. Also, as with mailing, another option would include asking a board member's corporation to absorb that cost. Decor. This is where creativity can go a long way in helping minimize costs. Depending on the type of event you are hosting, sometimes less is more. Entertainment. Asking for the performers to volunteer their time and talent. How about seeking a fan in your network of the band to help underwrite the expense? Permits, licenses, and insurance. There's no way around minimizing the cost of necessary permits, licenses, and insurance other than to book your event where the permits and licenses are built in already and not necessary to obtain on your end. Centerpieces. As I mentioned earlier, consider seeking an underwriter or centerpieces in kind. Also, it doesn't necessarily have to be floral or traditional if you are having a dinner or lunch. The last 2 years at our fundraising reception, we used 26 years of old annual reports, publications, postcards, stickers, and such that we have accumulated over the years as, quote, educational centerpieces. We considered it in part as educating our guests as one of our goals, and also served as a decorative centerpiece at the same time. Office supplies. Purchase only what you need. Buy in bulk for the following years. Miscellaneous and consultants. Do you find yourself purchasing or creating new signage every year? Consider using generic signage and reusing yearly. As for consultants, again, the question is if it outweighs using current resources and time. The timeline is central to keeping your event planning on track and defining tasks, responsibilities in a coherent and timely manner. The type of timelines you can create are endless. The point is to have some sort of timeline to avoid important essentials falling through the cracks. Here's one example. It's pretty detailed. Let's stay on this slide for a few seconds for you to review. On this slide, here's a snapshot of a section of the timeline we are using this year for our annual fundraising event. And we'll stay on this slide for a few seconds as well. I wanted to take a moment to address staffing your event. Having used various methods in delineating responsibilities to staff and volunteers, I have found that the template here works well with the size of our staffing. Being more of a visual person myself, I find that seeing a diagram of responsibilities of everyone accompanied by a day of timeline resonates better with most. In this example, Jessica, coded in the orange box on the upper left, is the overall person in charge of what the orange colored tasks are below. There is an understanding that there is a hierarchical communication flow from bottom on up. I, Gail, am responsible for the overall for the green colored tasks. Let's take a look at the text to give on the very right-hand side in green on the first top row. You can see that Andrea was in charge. It was understood that she was responsible for executing and troubleshooting. Bessie worked with her. If Bessie had any questions, it was understood she would ask Andrea. The expectation was Andrea would take care of the question and/or troubleshoot. If Andrea determined she was unable to do so, the understanding was then she would come to me. Again, from bottom to top as far as communication and troubleshooting was concerned. This alleviated our staff having to find Jessica or me, and it would leave us available to attend to other competing priorities. Okay, legal and insurance requirements. A rider is an insurance policy provision that adds benefits to or amends the terms of a basic insurance policy. Riders provide insured parties with the options such as additional coverage, or they may even restrict or limit coverage. For the most part, outside of insurance riders, what you see listed here are necessary insurance or permits for events for which your organization is responsible to secure, and especially if your event takes place in venues that are not hotels or larger establishments where there are already built-in provisions to which they are responsible. Hole-in-one insurance is is helpful for golf tournament fundraisers if you are offering a car, for example, on a par 3 hole for a hole-in-one. Let's take a moment to review some IRS considerations. Fair market value, or FMV. Fair market value is the price a willing buyer would pay for them, or what is comparable. When a nonprofit organization hosts a fundraising event, attendees may receive benefits while attending. For example, suppose a ticket to your fundraiser costs $500 and the attendee is served a formal dinner that costs your organization $100. The fair market value, or FMV, is $100. In other words, this is estimated to be an equivalent or comparable cost if your guests were to enjoy this exact meal elsewhere. To your donor, the fair market value helps determine the total amount of the ticket that is truly a gift or tax deductible to the donor. You must subtract the fair market value of the dinner, the $100, from the ticket price, which is $500. As a result, $400 of the $500 contribution would be considered tax deductible as allowed by law to the donor. This holds true for silent and live auctions as well. Let's say you are auctioning off an $800 airline travel voucher. Let's say the winning bid is $700. Because the winning bid is below the fair market value of $800, their $700 is not considered a donation in its truest sense, as they are receiving goods in exchange. If you provide a receipt or acknowledgement letter, you should state that their $700 is the winning bid with the fair market value of $800. On the other hand, if there's a bidding war and the winning bid is $850, then the $50, which is above and beyond the fair market value of the $800, would be considered a donation. Any receipt or written acknowledgement to the bidder should reflect the fair market value of the item, in this case $800, and the amount the donor gave to your organization for that item. The takeaway of fair market value is an organization may use any reasonable method to estimate the fair market value of goods or services it provided to a donor, as long as it applies the method in good faith. In good faith is the key here. By law, all sponsorships and underwriting should be acknowledged with the proper acknowledgement of their contribution and any fair market value details. Okay, heavy sigh, your event is now over. Now what? What are the next steps? We need to express our thanks to our donors, staff, committee, and volunteers. Whether through a letter, a thank you gathering, etc., a huge thank you is in order. The evaluation or debrief serves the purpose of collecting feedback on the guest experience, staff participation in the planning, coordinating, and executing, and similarly with your planning committee if you choose to have one. The process itself can play a dynamic role in the morale of your staffing committee. Again, to ensure everyone is on the same starting point, the goals and objectives need to be clearly stated from the get-go. Finally, this is now the time to begin cultivating your new donors, stewarding your existing donors, and converting new guests to donors. You may remember the fundraising pyramid diagram from our previous webinar, and we earlier talked about how special events are a great way to introduce new donors to your mission. I want to take a brief moment to review other events, such as third-party events. You may have a board member, for example, who is interested in hosting a luncheon or a reception for the purpose of raising funds for your organization. These types of events may or may not involve support from your staff. The takeaway here is that oftentimes staff resources will be necessary to help with the success of the event. For example, at AJC, we have board members who will host a dinner for the purpose of raising some funds. The expectation from our staff is minimal, but we do need to keep track of the contributions that come in and work closely with the board member who is hosting that dinner. The other mention I will make are third-party events where your organization may not know about it until it's over, and you are the surprise beneficiary of their generous contributions. And you will not have to lend any staff time or resources. The takeaway about these third-party events is the donor acknowledgements. If the event is such that each individual is making a contribution, then it's clear to whom the donor acknowledgements are sent. On the other hand, if there's a reception, let's say that the XYZ group is hosting a fundraiser and collecting cash contributions from individuals at the door, and no donor information is provided. The XYZ group gives you the collective contributions at the end of the evening. If this is the case, then the acknowledgement is made to the XYZ organization, not to the individual contributors. Separately, the cautionary consideration about these types of events where you don't know about them until it's over is the accuracy to which they represent your organization. In other words, are they using the correct version of your logo? What about the language they use to market the event or describe your organization? Is it accurate? It may not be. These are things where you will have no control because the event will have already taken place. Okay, now we're going to move on to fundraising campaigns. Fundraising campaigns are deliberate solicitations to your donor base or potential donors to raise funds. According to one study, Americans are generous and enjoy the sense of being part of a worthy cause achieved by charitable giving. In 2017, charitable giving in the US surpassed $400 billion for the first time, an increase over the previous year. Over the past 6 decades, individual donors continue to be the largest philanthropic group. Donations by individuals accounted for an astounding 70% of total donations, far surpassing corporations, foundations, and charitable bequests combined. Okay, we will briefly review now annual campaigns, capital campaigns, special campaigns, specific needs your organizations may have, and organization-specific campaigns. Okay, annual campaigns. Annual campaigns, they provide steady income, both restricted and unrestricted for your programs. It builds a database that tracks giving over time, provides patterns that can be used to discover which donors can give more. It encourages donors to give once again to your cause and to upgrade that gift. Annual campaigns, they bring in new donors to replace donors who eventually drop out due to a passing, or if they become disinterested in your organization, or perhaps they may face some economic challenges. There is considerable turnover among donors. It's important to keep finding new ones. Stewarding donors. This means the impact your organization is making and how donors make it all happen. And annual campaigns identify donors who are especially enthusiastic about your mission, and it moves them toward greater involvement. Here are some key ingredients to a successful annual campaign. Steering committee. This is the same as a planning committee. These are individuals whose input that are important to the success of your of your campaign. These could be both internal staff as well as external individuals from whom you would like their input. Campaign planning, this is merely what your planning will look like. A campaign committee, these are individuals who will help your organization by actively soliciting. Marketing, what are your plans in terms of marketing your campaign, the outreach plan? And with any campaign, it's always helpful for board members to support your campaign first, because if board members are going to be involved in helping solicit other gifts, then it's important that they give first, because oftentimes the question will come up that a board member might go out, solicit or ask for a contribution, let's say to Tom. Tom will then ask the board member, that sounds great. Have you supported the campaign yourself? If the board member were to say no, then how encouraging is that to Tom? Development of a prospect list. Who will you be soliciting in terms of current donors as well as prospects? Leading the campaign, will you have a campaign chair? You don't necessarily have to have one. Leading the campaign can come in the form of a large lead gift, right? To be able to announce your campaign saying that Paul Smith has generously contributed $100,000 to lead this campaign. Or perhaps you might have a donor who might be willing to provide a match to your campaign. So for example, Paul Smith has agreed to donate $25,000 if $25,000 is raised, right? Then that's a great way to launch a campaign. In evaluating your campaign, did you meet your goal? This is also an opportunity to look at what your challenges were. And then, of course, the ongoing cultivation and stewardship that you will have with your donors. Capital campaigns. This is specific to raising monies to construct the space or expanding space of your organization. The key ingredients we just covered for annual campaigns also apply here. Creating a gift chart can help your organization realistically plan on a goal. Thereafter, it can help target the gifts you are seeking. This is especially helpful for large campaigns such as annual and capital campaigns. But it can also be helpful for any campaign you do, as it sets realistic expectations and goals and documents giving patterns. The left column are the gift amounts you are trying to seek, with the second column estimating how many of those you feel you can secure. This gift chart is an example of a $500,000 campaign. Special campaigns are simply various solicitations you decide to do throughout the year. Oftentimes, holidays or specific commemoration days can anchor your giving campaign, or even mission-related markers during the year. AAJC, for example, does solicit during June, which is Immigrant Heritage Month, given that immigration and immigrant rights is one of our focal programs. When I worked at APISF, or Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund, this was an organization, a scholarship fund organization, providing scholarships to rising high school seniors and college students. One of our biggest campaigns was during graduation season and specific to the type of the organization APISF is. Specific needs campaigns can include if you're trying to raise funds for something specific. For example, currently AAJC recently launched a campaign to raise funds specifically to grow one of our legal advocacy programs. Our messaging to potential and current donors is how growing this program area will further impact the communities who will benefit. Okay, so as always, there's optional homework. So one question would be, think of your current annual fundraiser event. Do you have goals? Are they clearly stated? And currently, if you do not have an annual fundraising event, what are your challenges? What are your thoughts in trying to move one forward? So again, homework is always optional. If you can always feel free to email me, call me. More than happy to have a conversation with you on whatever question that you may have. So now I'd just like to offer some time for questions. Thank you.
Gail, thank you. So for folks who have questions, you can either use the questions box or chat box to type in your question, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute your line and you can ask the question directly. It looks like we already have one question. This is from Carissa. How and who determines fair market value?
Carissa, thank you very much for your question. In terms of, I'll answer the who. Who determines the fair market value? It would be the organization, right? Your organization, or specifically, if you are, let's say you are the one that is planning your event, you're working with the hotel, you're determining all the food and beverage needs, et cetera, et cetera. And so in terms of who determines it, it can be anyone who can determine fair market value within your organization. It's basically a mathematical calculation. What is the cost of the goods or services your donor or sponsor will be receiving, or your ticket purchaser, what they will be receiving, right? So in terms of who, again, anyone can determine the fair market value. And in terms of how, it really depends on what the event is, right? Again, using the case of a dinner, because a dinner is the most common type of special event. In that case, it would be the food and beverage, right? And so in the example that I used, right, that the hotel dinner and including, let's say, a beverage or two, I know that it's going to be $100, or it doesn't matter, $150, right? And so the question really is, right, it's a good faith. That $150 dinner cost to your organization, is that a comparable cost for that same meal if you were to obtain it elsewhere, right? Now, of course, it's going to differ, a few dollars here and there, but that's okay, right? It's that good faith effort of how that fair market value is being determined. I hope that makes sense. For those of you, this fair market value always raises a lot of questions. And there are also a lot of organizations who don't calculate the fair market value. It is very important to do so, because by law, you should be. And so if there are further questions about this, I am more than happy to hop on a call with you so that we can speak specifically about your event. And then I can speak directly to how your fair market value can be determined.
Thanks, Gail. And we have another question. We've been hosting the same event for several years now, and it doesn't seem to be growing as far as number of guests and revenue. There seems to be some reluctance by some of our staff and board to consider revamping or considering a new event. What can I
do? That's a good question. I would, think that this might be common for, several nonprofit organizations. When an event, seems to kind of plateau, right, after maybe a certain number of years, and the number of attendees or which is usually accompanied by a little dip, right, in your revenue, you start thinking, what is it time to, make a change? From my experience, change is sometimes very, right, for certain staff or certain board members to accept because it's been tradition, right? Or there may be some sense of ownership that some people may have. What I have done in the past when I have been in situations like this is that I will show, let's say, for the last 3 years, what the trend lines are, right? I will show what the revenue has been. I will show if there has been a decrease in the number of sponsors and also in the number of guests. And I'll do this in some sort of chart. I won't just talk about it. I will actually create a visual so that you are speaking to facts. In situations like these, I think it's better to be objective than to be subjective. And so by showing numbers, right? Numbers don't lie. It's not an opinion, it's a fact, right? And so I would start there. And because again, numbers don't lie, then once you have that established and everyone is looking at the same thing, then I think it can serve as a very helpful starting point then to have a discussion on, potential changes that the organization can make with the event.
Thanks, Gail. And we have a question from Karen. Is it a conflict or a double ask to do Giving Tuesday online and the end of the year appeal online? How do you handle those donor requests when they are so close together?
That's a great question. So, Giving Tuesday, I think everyone is familiar with Giving Tuesday, right? It's the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving. Giving Tuesday is a very specific campaign, right? It just happens to fall in the end of the year, right? And it also follows that marker of Black Friday, right? And Cyber Monday. And so there's now Giving Tuesday, right? And so it's in its whole own class within itself. So if you're going to participate in Giving Tuesday, I personally would suggest focusing on what the purpose of Giving Tuesday is, regardless of the fact that it falls at the end of the year. So in other words, your campaign messaging would focus solely on the fact of what Giving Tuesday is, what Giving Tuesday means to your organization, right? And to the donor. Whereas your end of year or EOY appeal, I would focus that specifically on the fact that it's the end of the year, right? And include elements that are completely separate from Giving Tuesday, because these are two separate campaigns.
Thanks, Gail. We have one more question. We want to do a silent auction, but it's been very difficult to secure items. I heard there are companies who specialize in securing items. Do you have any suggestions?
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. In regards to silent auctions, my experience has been that it is very difficult, very challenging, right, to secure items. Now, there's different ways that I look at this. Sometimes the expectation is that your organization itself needs to go out and go door to door trying to ask for contributions. I think if your organization is a local one where you are rooted in your community and you have community support, I often think that you may have a better chance, right, of securing local businesses to help with donating items for your silent auction. But that said, it is very, very labor intensive. So if you actually have a working committee, right, a community committee, this is where they can really be helpful, right, because they will have their own networks, they will have their own outreach, and they will be extensions, of you, right, of being able to go out in the community and trying to secure items. But at the end of the day, it's very labor intensive. And sometimes when you ask your board, that's, you might hear some silence because, and it's not because that they don't want to. Sometimes I think, they need some support by giving them specific ideas, right? In other words, to say, dear board members, can you help us by helping solicit for silent auction items or by donating something, yourself? I think it's sometimes better to say, can you please donate 5 bottles of wine? Right? That's a very specific ask, right? Also, I think it's helpful to say that, your organization, is also willing to accept monetary contributions so that you yourself can go out and get the items, right, that you would like at your silent auction. And so for myself, being at AJC, it's been 2 years now, and I believe we haven't really had a silent auction in the past that I'm aware of. And so trying to build one, as the years go by now, it's been very challenging, right? And so every year, I find ways of trying to secure some funds where then I just go out and get the silent auction gifts, right? And we still do get some silent auction in-kind contributions from our board members, which is extremely helpful. But that in itself, in terms of quantity, right, is not enough. And so you may want to consider, right, maybe if your family member, let's say, for example, is contributing to your organization, let's say they give $100 a month, a year, then perhaps they might consider using that $100, right, and allowing you then to go and secure some items. So those are some ideas if you or your organization is securing silent auction items on your own. On the other hand, there are companies that will do this for you, but it also comes with a hefty price, right? So these are companies that will have the really nice jewelry, they will have the brand, right, brand name handbags, they will have sports memorabilia, they will have, art pieces, and they're really wonderful to look at, right? Because I do believe that silent auction also serves as a form of entertainment. I've used these companies before, and for me, I felt that they were very helpful, right? And so, for example, what would be typical is that you would find a company who specializes in this, right? They will charge you, let's say, $5,000, right? For that $5,000, they will also bring all the items, right? You don't have to lift a finger and do anything, right? And then they will charge you, not charge you, but for whatever items are sold, right? They will take a small percentage of that, right? So at the very end, what the risk is here, right, is that you would have to have enough bidders who will be able to net you gross more than the 5,000 that you got to pay for the company, so that you come out ahead and not behind.
Thanks, Gail. We have no further questions at this time, so we will end the webinar. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and you'll receive a copy of the presentation and the recording after today. I did want to flag that we have a survey that's being circulated. You can find it in the original invitation for this webinar, and I'll also recirculate it with our follow-up webinar. And we'd love your feedback. This fundraising webinar series includes 6 webinars. Today's webinar is number 4 out of 6, and we'd love your feedback to figure out how to refine our topic for webinar 5 and also identify a topic for webinar 6. Also, at the conclusion of this webinar series, we'll also be circulating a second survey, because we'd love to hear how you've been able to use the knowledge and skills that we've discussed during these webinars and use it in your own fundraising organizational development. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll be in touch again soon.